Sorry, the number you have reached is not in service. Please check the number or try your call again. This is a recording.
Whew. I have no business making this film right now. I'm trying to plan events in 5 cities in between trips to Salt Lake, New York, and Albania. Over a 2-week period, I'm trying to squeeze in events in like 5 different cities, maybe more. And yeah, it's a bit too much. And I have no business making this film right now, but I do realize this film is really important because we are talking about King Kong. And then there will be, this is not really a Q&A. There's 2 questions I'm going to answer. The second one being long form. I could do films on the second one from now until the end of time. And I've been asked about this question, the second one, over and over and over again. And I've probably already mentioned a lot of ideas like this on this channel before. But I find the question fascinating because I've never been in the position to ask it myself. And I am I'm trying to figure out the right word, puzzled by how many people have asked me this question. But I think I have legitimate ways of answering it that will be helpful to people. But we need first and foremost to talk about King Kong, the 1976 King Kong, which I believe was the 5th installment of the King. It is the 5th entry in the King Kong franchise. I printed something out here. 1976 King Kong, Charles Grodin, Jessica Lange, Jeff Bridges. You might think this is, I don't know, maybe you think this is less than important. I think it's critical. I think it's a masterpiece. And I don't care what you think about the mechanical ape. That's not what I'm talking about. King Kong, 1976 American monster adventure film produced by Dino De Laurentiis. Man, that guy was a powerhouse. That guy's empire was unbelievable. So Dino De Laurentiis, directed by John Guillermin. It is a modernized remake of the 1933 film about a giant ape that is captured and taken to New York City for exhibition. Stars Bridges, Grodin, Lange in her first film role. And features mechanical effects by Carlo Rambaldi and makeup effects by Rick Baker. It's the 5th in the Hong Kong not the Hong Kong franchise. That would be another franchise. This is the King Kong franchise. And Michael Eisner was the one that proposed this thing. Basically, every production company in the world was involved at one stage of this thing before it settles out. It was released December 17, 1976, which means that I was born in 69. I probably saw it around 1980, okay? Now, my parents, in their infinite wisdom, my father was like, Jaws? No, you can't see Jaws because you'll never get in the water ever again. You won't even get in the creek after you see Jaws, which was probably a good move on my parents' part. Also, Apocalypse Now. I really wanted to see Apocalypse Now, and my dad was like, I don't think so. And my dad hated anything that could even remotely resemble something that was anti-American. So he looked at Apocalypse Now as a travesty of an insult of the American military and the war effort in Vietnam. So I remember when he said to me, no, you can't go to the theater and see Apocalypse Now. But when he came home from the movie theater that night, he was like, that movie was crap. And he just railed as only a father can rail. A guy who's under pressure from family and work and kids and wondering how his life unraveled to the degree it had. So he came home. Same guy, when I said, I'd really like to see The Deer Hunter, he was like, great idea. Let's make some popcorn and sit down to watch the Russian roulette scene in Deer Hunter. So I don't know, my parents were odd. 1980, I probably saw this movie. Couple of points, couple of takeaways here. And there's a photographer angle here, so if you're trying to figure out why I'm talking about King Kong, don't worry. There's a foothold, a toehold here for you guys. You're not going to fall. I had never seen Jessica Lange before in 1980, but I was probably at that time thinking, I don't know what that is, but I just want one of those, whatever that is. So she was pretty amazing. That's beside the point. Jack Prescott. So here comes Bridges, right? Beard, long hair, hippie, but he was cool and he was smart and he was a hippie and he was a photographer. And I was like, that guy, that character in 1980 planted some little seed in my crusty little brain that seemed like a pretty good job to me. He also had an F2 with a motor drive. At least I think it was an F2. I've never actually paid attention to what, maybe it's in the write-up somewhere. It looked like a Nikon F2. I'd never seen a camera like that. And I thought, you know what, that's pretty cool. But here's where we get interesting. This is where the movie takes on new meaning to me. So he's a stowaway. He gets on the Petrox Explorer in Surabaya. He sneaks on, he steals some clothing from the crew. I call this entrepreneurship. I mean, I think this guy's really going above and beyond. He sneaks on, then he makes his presence known, and then Grodin's like, oh, you're a spy, and they put him in detainment. They basically put him down in the hold. And then when they come to him and they realize that, okay, he's probably not a spy, his stuff's all scattered out on the table. And if I remember correctly, he only has 3 rolls of film, which is gutsy. That's really gutsy. I mean, normally you would have an entire suitcase full of film because you're on a ship out of Surabaya. When's the next time you're going to get to the 1-hour photo lab? It could be months at a time. Not to mention, you're on a ship that's looking for an undiscovered island. You may want to have more than three rolls of film, but he doesn't. And that to me was pretty cool. But here's where it gets really interesting. So when they come up on the fog bank, he rips through half a roll, motors across. And I'm thinking, dude, that's a lot of frames to burn on that. However, you are discovering an undiscovered island that no one has ever seen before, allegedly. And so I thought, okay, half a roll on the island, maybe I would do that. I'd probably shoot 3 frames. That was up to me. Then he sets up this bogus captain at the helm shot and asks him to pose and then rips through maybe a 1/4 roll of film. I got to ding him a little bit on this. However, there is a point to this. It was actually quite smart. He shoots too many frames because it's a throwaway image. But he also knows where his bread is buttered because he's a stowaway. They could still have him down in the hold, starving him to death. But no, he's now the official expedition's photographer, and Grodin is the one footing the bill. So you got to, it's like working for a high-end client who's selling bathroom fixtures. And you're like, my soul is dying because I took this shoot in the first place. I feel like hell. I feel like I'm going to die. I have no reason to live. But I'm going to shoot a picture of this guy who runs the company because he's got a massive ego and I need this paycheck really bad. There's no difference in that. Okay, he's playing to the ego as a stowaway. He's a true photographer. It's revealed when the small boat, the first exploration party to the island, when they take the small boat in and they get off, and Jessica Lange like talks her way onto the boat, and she's wearing like short shorts and a sailor top, and everybody's like, yeah, you can go to the island. And so the second she gets off the boat, she starts posing, and what does Bridges do? He turns into fashion photographer. He's only got 3 rolls of film. You're on an undiscovered island. You have no idea what you're going to find. Now you're down to maybe 2 rolls, and yeah, you're going to blow half a roll on fashion. That's when I knew I really loved that character. When I saw this as a kid, this is the true part. I was like, you know, that's what I want to do. That maybe is something that I want to do. This beats like, I don't know, what my dad does for a living, which looks really awful and boring. But there is one improbable scene of the entire movie. There's only one thing that I can fault. Could somebody still find an undiscovered island today? Probably not. But back then, yeah, you probably could have. In the 70s, collectively, we were idiots. We didn't know anything. So potentially you could have found an island. The giant ape, I don't know. Maybe there's a giant ape that got into some runoff at one of the Sandia labs or something. So potentially you could have a giant 100-foot ape, whatever. But the one thing that gets me, and then I'm going to move on. When they first land on the island, they take the small boat in. It's a skeleton crew. They got like 6 guys. And they come across the fortress, the giant fortress on the hill. And they're looking at this like 60-foot wall of earth and timber. And they're like, whoa. And Grodin says to Jack Prescott, look, dude, let me set you straight. This island is uninhabited, and that's an ancient ruin. And then you hear the drums start. And Bridges says something like, yeah, and there's a mechanical band in there or whatever. And so the one implausible scene in the entire movie is that right after that conversation, they're somehow inside the fort. Yeah, six gringos from who knows where suddenly get inside the fort. So if they got inside the fort that quickly, then how is that fort ever going to keep the ape out? Damn it, De Laurentiis, you should have thought of this stuff. They should have had like a portable blowtorch and cut through the wall or something. But that's really all I can find in terms of improbable scenarios about King Kong. Let's move on, shall we? So this is a question that's actually kind of bizarre. This is called, here goes. I recall from a past video that your Albania compadre, Elena Dorfman, Elena is the person that I co-teach with in Albania, is starting to work in cyanotypes. And also I saw on some other post, I can't recall where you are starting on the slippery slope with the gateway drug of cyanotypes as one who prints almost exclusively with alt process. I love it, it's just too expensive. Be curious to know what you think of historical processes for documentary projects in general and yours in particular. The short answer is I love alt process, and I think alt process for documentary projects is a fantastic idea. Raymond Meeks, by the way, if you haven't seen his work, unbelievable work, and he uses all different kinds of processes, and also his books are fantastic. If I was going to emulate somebody in the photography world today, he would be one of the people that I would emulate. I think he's fantastic. Never met him, don't know anything about him. All I know is every time I see his work and his books, I'm blown away. So yes, but here's the interesting wrinkle with cyanotypes. So I just came back from Florida. I gave a talk down in Florida. And while I was there, it was at a photo festival, and a friend of mine was co-teaching with Jill Enfield a class on cyanotypes. And they were using life-size, they were like 8-foot sections of fabric that were coated in the cyanotype material. And then people would lay down on these pieces of fabric in the sun, and they would create these huge life-size cyanotypes, and they were gorgeous. My friend who was co-teaching with Jill Enfield is a guy named Brendan Bannon. And Brendan I met while on a story in Sicily years ago. And Brendan was a photographer that spent a ton of time in East Africa, based out of Nairobi, covering that whole region, working for NGOs. He is a really intelligent dude. And in terms on the photography scale, he is one of the guys who truly cares. He gets involved with projects that give back in a way that's very, very rare. Hang on a second. I should have had this earlier. This is his Veterans Project book, which is called the Odyssey Project. These are veterans using exactly what I just told you, these life-size cyanotype materials, and these are service veterans who are basically doing self-portraits with these enormous cyanotypes. And this is a project that is absolutely spectacular. And when I said earlier I'm trying to plan events in 5 different cities wedged between Salt Lake, New York, and Albania, one of the things that I'm going to do is with Brendan and this project. So that's going to be hopefully in somewhere in New York at that time. So I totally agree and believe that alternative process is perfect for documentary projects or art projects or whatever else. I mean, any process you want to do. I'm not an alt process guy only because I haven't taken the time to explore it. I've done alt process in the past, but just dabbled in a few separate things because I get such limited focused time to work on projects. And a friend was over this morning early. He came over to sample my bulletproof coffee. And I said, unless I somehow find a way to not have to work for a living, which I can't imagine how that would work or how that would be possible. If I didn't have to work for a living, I would be producing work nonstop. But I have to work full time. And because of that, I don't think I will ever do the kind of projects I used to do simply because I will never get that kind of time. It's not like modern jobs are moving back to the way it was in 1970. They're moving towards the future, which means more work, faster pace, more distraction, more responsibilities. It's a more what I would call frenetic workplace than it was even a decade ago. I've had to change an alt process to go out and learn something new and then try to deploy it in the field. That's why primarily right now I'm shooting digital, is because digital is the only thing logistically that will work for what I have to produce. I cannot wait anymore. I can't shoot film, wait to ship the film, process the film, get it scanned, have that put on an FTP and come back. I don't think Blurb would even be willing to wait for that anymore. I could probably do maybe a special project or two here and there, but I'm not gonna do that. It just doesn't fit anymore. I love film. Don't go hating, baby. Okay, this is the really only reason that we're here, is this question, which, again, I'm a little puzzled by how often I've heard this, because I've never asked this question myself. And I'm not saying I'm better than you, although it's kind of hard to deny because I've got so much going on. No, the question is, how do you find story ideas? And I have a list on the computer. It's on my iPad, actually, because the iPad is the one thing that hasn't died. It's probably a safe zone. It's my safe zone, people. And I have a list of ideas that is pages long. And these are all long-form project ideas. The titles are there and the gist of the project. There is enough story there for 5 lifetimes. I would never be able to get to it, and I keep adding to it all the time. I just finished reading my 15th book this year, and numbers, I'm only stating the number because I keep track because people ask me what I read, and I post about each one on my website. Not each one, but the good ones I post on my website. It's about tea. It's called All the Tea in China. It's about Robert Fortune, who was a British botanist and adventurer who was tasked by the East India Company in the 1800s to go to China and steal tea from China, which basically, in essence, changed the world. Reading a lot. But let's get back to this. How do you find story ideas? Just in that book alone, there's 100 different ideas. But the number one thing to me, and this is not something that ties to photography per se, the number one thing to me, I guess saying have to be, maybe is a bit much. I would suggest this, urge you to become this if humanly possible, is to be curious. You have to be curious about the world. And I say that because we live in a world where there are a ton of open-minded people. I would consider myself one of those people. And there's a lot of closed-minded people. I know someone who's lived in the same city for 50 plus years of their life, and they're only like around 60. They're closed-minded. And they're kind of at a perpetual point where they can't get ahead. They can't even find something that makes them happy. There's perpetual unrest. There's uncertainty. There's changing job after job after job. And they will often call and say, like, kind of just run through what's happening to them with me. And anytime they ask me to suggest something, and I do, before I can get the sentence out, they say, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested. And they live in a city that happens to have an amazing mission complex. It's one of the best mission complexes in the United States. It's incredible. I've been there multiple times. This person has lived in this city for over 50 years and has never been to the mission complex. That to me is a closed-minded person. And when I suggest, like, hey, you've got a few hours, why don't you go? They're like, not interested. Well, why don't you think? Not interested. Have you ever thought about reading? Not interested in that. It's just no, closed doors. If that's the mentality that you have about the world, finding stories is probably going to be pretty tricky. For whatever reason, of all the people in my family, I got the curiosity gene. My mother had it as well, much more so than my father. My father was very linear, very closed off. The only reason my father would ever go anywhere is if he could either go bird hunting or fishing. The only way to pry him out of the United States, he'd go to Scotland, he'd go to Portugal because he could go bird hunting, he'd go to Canada to go fishing, but that's it. He had no interest in any other culture. It was only exporting his own culture from home to go to another place to do what he was already doing at home. That's not me. My other siblings don't really travel. They don't leave the country. They don't travel. There's no, I've never heard them say, man, I've never been to South America. I really want to go to South America. They have no interest in South America. They will probably never go there, never travel. And that's totally fine. They're happy. They're doing their own thing. For whatever reason, for me, I got the curiosity gene. I want to know what's around the corner. I've never been to that place. I'd like to kind of go see it myself. I don't know what impact tea had on the industrialization of Britain in the 1800s and how that differed from France and Germany, which is what I learned about this morning when I was reading. I didn't know that until this morning. I didn't know exactly how tea impacted that until I read about it. And so being curious, if you are curious, you will never have a shortage of ideas for projects. The problem you're going to have is time in finding time to actually do them. The second thing is you've got to read. You've got to read. And I don't mean iPad, iPhone, scrolling through news articles that aren't really news articles, that are short form, that are going to tell you about 500 different topics at superficial level. Most of what you see online is like skipping a stone across the surface of a lake. It's bip, 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 and then people talk as if they're educated about a subject matter. The Chinese surveillance balloon is a perfect example of this. Really pick any topic. When you have internet-heavy friends or family who are scouring through dozens of news sites every day, reading sound bites and snippets, most of the time that are tainted in one direction or another, that is not educating yourself. In fact, I think it makes the situation worse. And so reading to me is book-length material only. And I read primarily nonfiction, although I love fiction and I think good fiction can open up ideas just as nonfiction can. I think music and art can do the same thing. So again, if you're curious about this stuff, like for example, the person I was describing earlier, if I said, hey, I just read this book on tea, before I could even get tea out of my mouth, they would say, I'm not interested in that. I just don't want to read that. I don't care about China. I don't care about tea. I don't care about England or industrialization. They just don't care. They're not curious about anything. Me, reading is the gold mine. And I've got, like I said, finished that book this morning. I've got 3 more books lined up. And it's just, there's an insatiable thing. The project that I am starting right now, which I don't want to share with you on this particular film because it deserves to have its own film, and I want this to be a part of whatever MILNOR 3.0 online that I've mentioned over the past few weeks about the subscriber site, the paid newsletter, all that stuff. This is the story that will kickstart that campaign, if you will. That story came from 2 books. It came from a field guide book, and it came from a book that someone did with Blurb 10 years ago. That's like an art book. And the combination of those 2 things allowed me to visualize what I wanted. And now I'm going into the field. I did my first shoot on Sunday. I'm going into the field and trying to fulfill what that vision is in my head. But it came from 2 books. Books are your answer, my friend, whoever you are. Number 3, or third poignant point, you cannot be distracted. You cannot be distracted. Now, I'm not going to translate what I mean by that. I think you're all adults. And I think you know how and when you are distracted in your life. I guarantee you already know how and when you are distracted. There is a myriad of reasons and ways to be distracted today, more so than at any point in human history, other than maybe when we were living in caves and the second you walked out the cave, you could get slaughtered by some beast. You'd probably be like, oh, look at the flowers. And then just something would just twist your head off and then just like drink your blood and then squeeze you out and throw you aside. You cannot be distracted. The reason why I can get so much done and that so many people say to me, wow, man, I can't believe how many things you got going, is I'm not distracted. I have a plan. And I don't look at routine in life as a negative or something that is less than exciting. I think a good routine in your life, and I'll just share a little bit here. I'm not saying this routine is good for you. It's just what I do. But I get up at a certain time every day and I make coffee or tea, and I read for however long it takes me to finish that coffee or tea, which is typically 45 minutes or so. I do not ever touch a piece of electronics in that time frame. There's no phone, no iPad, no computer, nothing, because the second you do, this wins every single time. And so I purposely do this. This is a plan that I put in place because I figured out it works for me. So I read. And when people say to me, oh, I don't have time to read. I can't believe you read that much. I don't have time to read. They're lying. They do. They just choose not to. The vast majority of us have time to read, but we choose to use our time in other ways, which is fine. You might watch TV. I don't. You might watch a movie every night. I don't. You might sleep until 8 o'clock. I don't. You might get up and love nothing more than checking Facebook on your phone. I don't. I don't want to do that. Reading is the priority. So I get up, I read, then I do my body weight core yoga routine, which takes 30 minutes, and then I either run or I cycle. And so I want to be back in this house by about 8 o'clock because I need to start my blurb day. Even though it's 7 o'clock in California, Seattle, still I feel like I need to be up and running, and I've got so many things to do that's what I have to do. I'll take a break in the middle of the day for a thing of tea and also read. And then I sometimes will go out late in the day for a hike, a run, another ride, something, birding, or I'll start working on a project or whatever, and then I repeat the cycle. That's what's effective for me, and that allows me to focus and concentrate and get a ton of stuff done without being distracted. Let me just give you 3 examples, 3 projects. My Sicily project came from another photographer. That idea came from a photographer who had gone to Sicily, someone I knew in Los Angeles, and she called me when she got back and said, hey, you should come look at this work. So I went to look at her work and I looked at it and said, wow, what is this? And she said, oh, this is the story. This is where it's at. This is how I found out about it. And she said, you and I, we should go back together next year. So we did. And then we went the next year and the next year. That's how that Sicily project came to be. Very simple. That project was interesting to me because it was based on the concept of faith. I'm not religious. I don't identify with any religion. I don't go to church. I don't have faith, religious faith. And so people who do fascinate me. So the project was great. I don't speak Italian. I don't speak Sicilian. I'm not Catholic and I'm not religious. Perfect. Who am I? Who better to tell this story than me? So to go over and show people the concept of faith, that's the entire project was based around that. Next up, a project called Man versus Nature. And this project came from reading about the food chain. Humans are the only species that alter our position on the food chain for entertainment or sport. We swim with white sharks. We hike in grizzly country. We put ourselves in positions where we are no longer on top of the food chain. If you're a tuna, you don't do that. And so I found this fascinating. This set off a chain reaction of 10 years of stories based on the concept of man versus nature. I did land speed record people. I did big wave surfing. I did sharks. I did all kinds of stuff, that projects that tiled into that concept of man versus nature. I could shoot on that project for the rest of my life if I wanted to. Last one, a project called Wildness, which was based here in New Mexico. I shot on this project for 4 or 5 years before Blurb sort of took over my life. This came from growing up on a ranch in Wyoming and realizing that less than 2% of the American population is involved in farming and ranching, which tells you 98% of the population has their head up their butt when it comes to knowing how farming and ranching actually works. I found that interesting. Through that process, I discovered that New Mexico was considered the last of the wild states. And this came from reading and research. New Mexico is considered the last of the wild states of the American West. If you got into trouble anywhere else in the American West, you could flee to New Mexico and the authorities would leave you alone. It's one of the reasons that Billy the Kid basically never left New Mexico, is that he could exist here even though he'd done all kinds of nefarious things. So I was like, that's interesting. And I was also really tired of the dime store interpretation of cowboys in the American West and that sort of kitschy, over-the-top thing that's played out at every roadside park and Route 66 thing. I'm not interested in that. The concept of wildness was being revealed in all aspects of society: immigration, law enforcement, architecture, education. All of these things reflected that concept of wildness, of how this culture was different from anywhere else in the world. That's what I was focusing on. And that's how I came to it. Wyoming as a kid, 2% involved in farming and ranching. 98% of the public is completely disconnected to what happens on farms and ranches. And then through that research, what's specific about New Mexico? New Mexico's last of the wild states. That's interesting. Why is that? How is that reflected in culture and society? And oh, by the way, how does New Mexico represent the rest of the United States? Because I can't travel to all of the American West. I need to use this place as a representation. That's how story ideas come to be. Number 4, lazy is unacceptable. A ton of us are lazy. We find excuses not to do things. We waste our time looking at stuff online. We waste our time in coffee shops. I'm not a coffee shop guy. I went to a coffee shop the other day to meet someone who came to me through YouTube, which was really cool. I'm starting to get into the field now a lot more, and I'm meeting a bunch of people who actually found my YouTube channel and reach out and say, hey, dude, I'm going to be in Santa Fe, or I'm going to be here and there, and we actually getting together. It was great. So Ted, how you doing? Howdy. That was a great meeting. And he sent me down the watch rabbit hole. I'll never forgive you for that, Ted. But I'm not a coffee shop guy. And when I go into coffee shops, you know what I find interesting? Is you see all the hipsters. Santa Fe, by the way, prior to COVID, almost no hipsters at all. Post-COVID, they came from LA, San Francisco, New York, Austin. They flooded in, and now there's a whole, I would say, battalion-size group of hipsters overrunning the coffee shops in Santa Fe, which makes me want to go to the coffee shops even less. But what's interesting is when you go in and they're all in their positions, wearing their costumes, and they've got their laptops up, you ever watch their eyes? Most of the time, they're not looking at the laptop. They're looking at each other, and they're looking at everybody that comes in. That's a waste of time to me. That's lazy and distracted and unacceptable. So you cannot be lazy. Vast majority of people watching this channel are 1%ers in the world. And you may not technically be in the 1%, I'm not, but what I mean by that is we have opportunity. And if we're lazy, we're squandering, and that's unacceptable. 5, ego is unacceptable. I don't care what you've done in the past. I don't care what you did yesterday. If you have an ego, it's disgusting. And photographers are notorious for having egos, insecurity, combative, argumentative, accusational. It is not a good reputation. And as a photographer, there is absolutely no reason for you to have an ego. If you do, it sucks, and you better get beyond it because there's no reason, no excuse. If you want to learn to find stories, you got to go get dirty. You got to get out in the world and get dirty. You cannot sit at home. You cannot watch TV. You cannot surf the internet. You cannot watch movies all day long. You have to go get dirty. That's the fun part of being in the field, and be prepared to fail because 99% of the time you're going to fail in the field. That's okay. Everybody else does the same thing. Number 6, and finally, carry your camera and talk to people. If you carry your camera out into the world and you talk to people, stories are going to come to you because once people understand your intention, they want to help. They want to get involved. Not everyone. You're going to run into the a-holes who tell you you can't be there, you can't take photographs. I walked to the end of a jetty once out into the Pacific, way out at the end of this stone jetty that went way, way, way out there. Me and my little Leica around my neck, and I'm framing up a picture of the end of the jetty and the Pacific Ocean. There is literally nothing to be seen as far as the eye can see. All you can see is a little piece of the jetty in the foreground and then empty Pacific Ocean. And some a-hole fishing behind me says, "Hey, you can't photograph here." So those guys, oh man, I had brief moments of like, how do I hide a body at the end of the jetty? I did. I had that thought just for a second. How do I hide this? And is that fishing equipment he's using valuable enough for me to keep? And how do I get fingerprints off of that? All that stuff flashed through my mind when he said this. Those people are out there, and they're out there more today than ever before. And so you can't do this, you can't do that, whatever. But most of the time, if I drive down to a town on the border and I'm walking around making pictures, people are going to ask what you're doing. That's no doubt. You're going to feel a little friction from time to time. But when you express your intent that you are not a looky-loo, that you are not an Instagrammer, that you are there trying to tell stories, most of the time people will say things like, "Oh, you should talk to my cousin Reggie. You won't believe what happened to him." And you're like, "Really? Is Reggie around?" "No, but I'll call him." And then you're having beers with Reggie. And that's how things work. And all of a sudden, Reggie peels back the veil and says, "Do you want me to smuggle you across the border?" And you say, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea." And then you're off. And then you're Jeff Bridges. Take more than 3 rolls of film. And if Jessica Lange shows up, take her as well. Because that's just a good idea.
We're sorry, the number you have reached is not in service. Please check the number or try your call again. This is a recording.